Dear guests, good evening. My name is Uliana Chromyak, and I am the Executive Director of Ukraine House Davos. On behalf of the organizing committee, it is my great pleasure to introduce our last panel for today, and last panel generally of Ukraine House Davos, unfortunately. So please, after this panel, we will have the closing remarks, so please stay. And after that, it will be followed by the networking reception. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the panel, What is at the Stake in Ukraine? And the moderator of this panel is KERRY Kennedy, President Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Applause. MYLOVANOV, President KYIV School of Economics. NATALIYA BUGAYOVA, Institute of the Study of War. And Stephen Moore, founder, Ukraine Freedom Project, former Chief of Staff for a senior House Republican. Wishing you a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm so happy to be here with all of you, and thanks everyone for coming and for being here till the very bitter end of the Davos conference, and you chose the best way to end your Davos experience, so thank you. We're going to hear from each of our panelists, and then we're going to have a robust Q&A, so please start thinking right now of the questions you want to ask or the comments you want to make. I'm just going to lay out a few things to start with. Nearly 700 days ago, without provocation, Russia attacked Ukraine. Ukraine didn't ask for the war, and this is a war Russia imposed. Let's be very clear. This is a war that Russia imposed on Ukraine. The reasons that we support Ukraine are well known. We support Ukraine because we don't want a world in which nations can invade and colonize one another, especially smaller nations. We support Ukraine because we have benefited from a rules-based order for the last 70 years. We support Ukraine because we don't want to return to 2,000 years of European history of war upon war upon war. We support Ukraine because of sorry, I'm having a little trouble reading my writing. Because of our fear of radiation and nuclear security. We support Ukraine because of food security. Ukraine is the market basket to the world. We support Ukraine because of the need for punishment for war crimes. We support Ukraine because of the need for restitutions, for the lives lost, for the hospitals, for the schools, for the jobs, for the land, for the farms, for the people who have lost everything that they've built up for generation upon generation, taken from them by the Russians in a moment. We support Ukraine because every time Russia sends another bomb, it challenges all of us in our hearts. It challenges us about what it means to be human. And we support Ukraine, I think, because in a world where we're overwhelmed by the challenges, by global warming, by economic insecurity, by famine, by COVID, Ukraine stands there and says, we can fight, we can make a difference. We will not be bowed even in the face of this overwhelming force. So Ukraine shows us, reminds us of the bravery, the courage that's in all of our hearts. And these are some of the reasons that we support Ukraine. Now, in the face of all of that, and so many other reasons we're going to hear from today, there's a waning of support. Why? What is that waning about? Well, I would say there are 4 reasons. One is there's fatigue. We live in the world of Twitter, in which people will have a very short attention span. So that's one reason. 2, there's distraction, especially by Israel and Gaza right at the moment. But so many other things that keep coming up. 3, people and leaders are afraid of their economies, and they're afraid of spending more and more money on war in another country. And 4th, I think people are afraid of what looks like a forever war. So what I was hoping we could do today is on this panel, I mean, there's been 3 days of discussions about Ukraine at Davos, 4 days of discussions about Ukraine at Davos. The question is, how do we counter those arguments? What do we do so that the whole world comes back and supports Ukraine in every way we need to do everything we can to assure the victory of this extraordinary country, this extraordinary people, and the victory ultimately for the values we hold most dear, for democracy, for human rights, and for the dignity of every human being. That's what this panel is about. So I'd like to start with you, Steve. We're starting with you because you have a slide presentation.
Меня зовут Степан, я американец волонтар, хочу cappuccino за молоко без лактози. And that's the best of my Ukrainian, so I'm going to start in English now. I came to Ukraine on day 5 of the war because I have a lot of Ukrainian friends, and they needed my help. And so I was in a position to help, so I hopped on a plane and went to Chernivtsi. I was in Chernivtsi on day 5 of the war and just started helping and continued to help. I started the Ukraine Freedom Project, which is my NGO, and we've gotten about $1.2 million worth of stuff to the front. And now what I'm doing, because I used to be a chief of staff to a member of leadership in the House of Representatives, I'm telling my former colleagues in Congress what's really happening in Ukraine with firsthand data-driven information. And my colleague, Anya Shvetsova, is the Ukrainian who knows the most people who work in Congress. She and I just got back from D.C., where we met with about 100 Republican offices in the House and the Senate. So I want to share with you today what I learned from that. We also did some research. We did some sociology, as the Ukrainians may say, but some public opinion research on what Republican voters think about Ukraine and what messages you can use to change their opinions. So I'm going to share that with you today. So it's going to be a little depressing at first, but there's hope at the end, I promise. So so there we go. So there are 3 countries that are existentially dependent on U.S. aid. Who can name them? Raise your hand if you got one. All right, I'm going to start calling on people. Israel, well done. And Taiwan. What's the third? There you go. So Ukraine is now in a very exclusive club. And I want to tell you about the other members. Pro-Israel forces in America spend about $1 million a quarter, every quarter, lobbying Congress with a registered lobbyist. Taiwan does about $600,000 a quarter. And a registered lobbyist is someone who spends most of their time, 20%, more than 20% of their time, contacting members of Congress, preparing to contact members of Congress. So Ukraine has 0 registered lobbyists. So for everyone who's contacting Congress on behalf of Ukraine, it's their part-time job, it's their hobby. So now the Russians have a lobbyist, or at least the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarch, has a lobbyist. And there's a guy going around Capitol Hill, and he's telling people on Capitol Hill that Zelensky persecutes Christians. He's banning a Christian faith. He's arresting nuns and priests. And so the Russians are very effective. And let me tell you one more thing, just to give you a sense of what we're up against. I was visiting an office of a Republican member who's very pro-Ukraine. He has his family has Ukrainian roots, and and he gets about 30 to 50 calls from his voters per day, right? They call him and say, hey, something's wrong with my Social Security, don't vote on this, do vote on this. One day, he got 700 calls from his voters telling him not to vote for aid to Ukraine. So that is what we're up against. So, and this is how effective it is. This is some economists polling. At the beginning of the war in March of 2022, President Zelensky had a favorable image among 2/3 of Trump voters. Now you can see that's down about half of that. So this is how effective the Russian propaganda has been. And this is a poll that we did that I mentioned earlier. The number one issue to Republican voters is 58% is border security. At 1% is the war in Ukraine. So this is a tough vote for Republicans. And this is in part because of 23 months of almost unanswered Russian propaganda in the conservative media. And so what we're doing right now with Republicans is not working, unfortunately. And there's a lot of people working really hard on this. The ambassador, there's a lot of folks that are, coming and lobbying Congress, but it just is not working. And part of the reason is that there's two types of lobbying you can do. Is I can come to you as a member of Congress, and I say, Congressman Smith, here's reasons why you should support Ukraine. And Congressman Smith says, oh, that's great. I understand that. I want to support Ukraine. But I just got 700 calls from my voters telling me not to support Ukraine. I was elected to represent these people. So that's kind of what we're up against. And now we got to talk to the voters. And just one more thing on the power of propaganda. 60% of Republican voters are Christians, self-identified evangelical Christians. And 24% of them believe that Russia is a country that promotes and encourages traditional family values. And if you're a Tucker Carlson voter, does anyone know who Tucker Carlson is? Tucker Carlson is a conservative news figure who is just pro-Russia, in the tank Russia. He gets 10 million people to watch him on Twitter every time he comes on. So his viewers think 39% of them think that Russia promotes family values. So what messages do you think work with Republicans? All right, someone raised their hand. Give me one sentence. If you could talk to a voter in New Hampshire is voting on the president right now, give me one sentence on what you would say to a Republican voter to convince them to vote for Ukraine aid.
Are they the ones that have the state slogan, live free or die?
Yeah.
So I'd be like, okay, live free or die. That's exactly what's happening in Ukraine. And something, I tie it back to them, that they won't be able to live free or something like that.
Yeah, wow, she's good. So freedom is something that polls well. Well done, thank you. Yeah, one other person, give me one.
Yeah, I would say that supporting Ukraine now prevents a war with U.S. and NATO. So it's national security for Americans.
All right, okay, you got who passed out my presentation? So those are both really good. So thank you for that. So here's what doesn't work. Talking about building the industrial base. Doesn't work. If you talk about it this is actually a quote from a senator that we should making weapons to send to Ukraine is helping America rebuild its industrial base, and the Ukrainians are destroying the army of one of our biggest rivals. 51%, not a stellar. You want better than 51%. And if you just say it simply, if aid to Ukraine creates jobs in my community, I want members of Congress to vote for Ukraine aid. 40%. Accountability doesn't poll well. They talk about it a lot, does not poll well. Let me show you what does work. And this is, so Russians are torturing and murdering Ukrainian Protestants for their faith in the occupied areas of Ukraine. It's not getting out. And when you tell the evangelical Christians that vote Republican, 70% of them are more likely to support aid to Ukraine. So I want to show you a 90-second video, and
my name is Mark Sergeyev. I'm a youth pastor of the Melitopol Christian Church. Melitopol is in the south of Ukraine, which Russia captured. The Russians arrived very quickly. On February 24th, 2022, the city was taken and occupied. The first thing the Russians did upon arrival was go to the churches. And here, there were a lot more Protestant churches than Orthodox. But on the 9th of March 2022, Russian soldiers broke into the church. They started interrogating us and wanted us to raise Russian flags, saying that we were now part of Russia and Russian. We had a big cross in our yard, which clearly showed that it was a Protestant church. Well, they cut down this cross, and now in its place is a Russian flag. At the moment, there's not a single Protestant church in Melitopol. They destroyed everything. For example, regarding my church, they turned it into a Russian ministry of culture, and the local residents, young people, were brought there to celebrate Russian holidays and Russian traditions, and that's all. As a person who survived Russian occupation, who was beaten by Russian soldiers, I wanted to say one thing. This war is not only about trying to capture Ukrainian territories, resources, and land. It's also a war against our faith and against our God. Therefore, every day tens of thousands of people kneel and pray for peace in Ukraine.
So we have showed that video to dozens of congressional offices. It makes an impact. People see it. We've had digital ads in Iowa and in Louisiana. Iowa because there was an election in Iowa last week, or this week, Monday, and then Louisiana is where the Speaker of the House is from. He is a Baptist activist prior to being in Congress. Baptist is actually the largest Protestant denomination in Ukraine, so we're driving that point home. So here's just a few other messages that work. You talk about war crimes, Russia torturing Ukrainian Protestants, that works. 98% of Republican voters think that the world is unstable. 80% of them think it's very unstable. If you talk about World War III, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea working together, that polls well. And the gentleman back there giving weapons now to the Israelis and the Ukrainians, that's a good one. Finally, here's something that most of the people in this room can do. If you're Ukrainian, find an American, thank them. Being thankful helps. And you know, every Ukrainian should find someone online in Texas, Florida, Louisiana, and Ohio, and you know, tell them, you know, don't believe J.D. Vance. We are thankful for the weapons that you send us. They keep my family safe at night. So with that, I'll give it to my colleagues.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Just for the record, I don't make a habit of listening to Republican voices. So I'm glad that Ukraine is bringing us all together. Yeah, exactly. So, Natalia, talk about what's at stake if Ukraine fails to win.
Thank you. It's great to be here and be a part of this panel, and also thank you for the organizers and the team for this incredible week. I do think it's important to lay out clearly what is at stake if there is a failure in Ukraine, specifically for the United States, for NATO countries in Europe. I think we're very clear on what's at stake for Ukraine, its existence as a nation, as people, as concept that Putin is trying to erase as we speak. But I would like to talk about the stakes for the US, NATO countries in Europe in particular. Let me be explicit. If Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, it would be a self-imposed strategic failure for the US. A number of things will happen. First, US and NATO will face another war under much worse conditions with the same escalation risk, with much higher costs. Why would we do that? I think second, we need to really understand that we will face a reconstituted Russia that is more intent, capable, but also more confident that it can undermine the US and NATO. And I would like to circle back on that point in just a minute. I think we also need to understand that the cost of deterrence for the United States and anyone in the free world globally will increase, because we'll face a world that is antithetical fundamentally to our interests, but also the world is going to be very expensive for us to maintain our interests and security. I think we'll also face a very ugly world in which Russia's way of war and Russia's way of life is normalized. And let's not forget that there are 8 billion people who are watching this war. They may not remember the nuances, but they will certainly remember the principles that were tolerated and countered. I think for US in particular, I will also mention one more risk, that the adversaries will learn that US can actually be manipulated into abandoning its own interests. Because if there is a collapse of Western aid and Russia wins, it will necessarily mean that US perception of its own interests has been altered. And altering America's will is no small thing, because America is an idea, it's a choice, and America's power in the world depends in no small part on people and countries choosing the US as a partner of choice. And an adversary who learns how to alter those realities is an existential threat. That would be a very dangerous lesson to teach to other US adversaries, and I think it's a major threat. I'd like to expand just a little bit on the military point, on the military outlook if there is a failure in Ukraine. So first, in the extreme case of collapse of the Western aid, it won't be a frozen front line. Actually, Russia's invasion will accelerate because it would be very difficult for Ukraine to fend off Russian military without certain capabilities. In the event of a premature cessation of hostilities or a slowed Ukraine's momentum, if the Western aid falls short of Ukraine's battlefield needs, we'll face likely frozen front lines and Russia getting time to regroup and prepare for the next attack, which they will because they made it very explicit. They still aim to conquer the whole territory of Ukraine, but also they're very explicit in their intent to rebuild large-scale warfighting capability. I think another thing will hold true in the event if Russia wins in Ukraine. NATO will face Russian military presence from the Black Sea to the Arctic. Russia will finalize the absorption of Belarus. It will try to link military gains between Belarus and Ukraine. It will require US to deploy more of the ground troops to Europe, including also very expensive stealth aircraft, because it will be required with a new air defense posture. That would be incredibly expensive and also probably potentially in perpetuity. Again, why would we are off to a path of self-defeat when we can still achieve an outcome that actually is the most preferred outcome, not only for Ukraine, but also to the United States. I'd like to just add to the point about NATO and Russia, the risk of NATO and Russia war, in this case will also increase. Because let's not forget that Russia's goal is not only to take control of Ukraine, it is also to break NATO. Russia is still pursuing that goal. That intent hasn't changed. And in the event, if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, the Article 5 actually would be under threat, because let's not forget, Article 5 is not a magic shield. Perception of resolve of the allies to commit to it matter greatly for essentially Article 5 credibility. And in the world where Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, the confidence in that resolve of US and others to commit to Article 5 will be challenged. There is all reason to believe that US will commit to Article 5, but there's also all reason to believe that in this case, Putin will think that it may not. It increases the cost, it increases the risk of miscalculation by Russia, and that's how we got here in the first place. Because Putin thought that he can capture Kyiv in 3 days and not face any pushback from Ukraine or the West. So I think that's actually a very important point to believe that Article 5, again, it's not a magic shield, and it does depend on the perception of a credibility and resoluteness of the member states to actually act on it if and when the time comes. So I would start with that, and we can dive into other points as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Timothy, we were talking earlier about sort of the two opposing faces of Ukraine, or reputations of Ukraine. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, so Ukraine has two brands. One brand is of a corrupt country. The other brand is of a resilient country which, against all odds, does the impossible with a high moral authority and something the world has forgotten And that's an example to live up to. And now this good brand is being confounded, or, you know, Russia, and not only Russia, is working hard to smear the high brand with by confusing it with the low brand and bringing in a lot of other irrelevant, in many ways, for those who have clarity of thinking, arguments, but they work, they're emotional. These two brands are different in the sense that the first one applies to the rules, to the lack of institutions, and to some legacy structures, networks, deep state, and so on. But the new brand emanates from the history of revolutions in the last 30 years and desire of Ukrainian people for justice and for human rights. And so the cultural carriers of the high brand are people, whereas the cultural carriers of the bad brand, in fact, in my view, is the legacy, and it's very much Russian culture. And that's what Ukraine is trying to shed. Because the idea that the most powerful one rules the world, that you can decide everything by a bribe, you can buy people, you can intimidate people by force, regardless of what the truth is and what the justice is ultimately the Russian idea today. And when we talk about corruption, that's the same idea. Corruption is the idea that rules don't matter, you can buy things. And that's what Russia is trying to prove to the world. That the truth doesn't matter, justice doesn't matter, it's just the force and the money behind it that matters. And so in that sense, Russia is trying to corrupt the entire world in non-trivial but systemic effort. And I also think that the US has forgotten what it has learned during the Cold War. The idea of deterrence is that you escalate in response to an action by an adversary. You commit to escalate. It's counterintuitive for a lot of us. But any game theorist, any strategist, anyone who has studied the world knows that you have to commit to escalate. That's the notion of nuclear deterrence. You commit to destroy the world so that no one even tries to play with the idea that can trigger destruction of the world. And what the US is now doing is just the opposite of it. It is afraid of escalation. It almost commits publicly not to escalate. And definitely the actions are speaking towards the new vision for the United States, which is de-escalation. And what we know from the history is that the commitment to not escalate invites escalation. And that's exactly what we have been seeing throughout the last 2 years with authoritarian regimes ganging up together and poking and trying to escalate everywhere throughout the world. So for many people, in many discussions, we think about Ukraine as the most important or the least important, isolated, but it's a part of a broader pattern. Putin is a war president. He came to power on destruction of Chechnya and committing horrible crimes against humanity there. There was Georgia. Had it not been actually for a harsh, political, but harsh response at that time credible to Russia, Russia might not have stopped in Georgia. There is Moldova, there is Azerbaijan, there is Nagorno-Karabakh, there is Armenia, there is Libya, there is Syria. It's a pattern. Ukraine is just a part of this pattern, and what is shocking for us is that because we as the world didn't respond properly, because we were afraid of escalation in 2014, when annexation of Crimea felt like something that Russia will never move beyond. That's how it feels, that Russia will never move beyond Ukraine. No, that's why we can abandon Ukraine, because Russia will not dare. If we remember what the spirit, what the atmosphere was in 2014, that was exactly the atmosphere about Crimea. The world felt that Russia has stepped out of bounds with Crimea, and it will never dare to move beyond that. But it did. And so those who believe that Russia will not move forward, either after Ukraine or instead of Ukraine, when it gets tired with Ukraine, it will move on something else, another theater. Those who don't understand that are in self-denial. And, you know, these are the two brands of Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Timothy is the dean of one of the great universities, the top university in Ukraine. Can you talk about the importance of education, what you're doing to educate the next generation in the midst of war? How does that work? And why should we be supporting Ukrainian education at this moment?
So this is really sweet that you asked this question, and it was not planned. I was not prepared for a question like that. And in academia, they teach us, at least in my field, to have three answers. It should feel like one answer, but it's really three. It's one sentence, 30 seconds, that's the second, and then expanded answer. And so the short answer is that if there are no universities of the world class in Ukraine, the talent will leave Ukraine, especially post-war. Once the people will feel that the sovereignty and existence of Ukraine is secured, people will take a break. Those who have fought, those who have worked. And if at that time we cannot offer to them places where we can incubate talent at the level of Harvard, and I'm serious, and I think it feels really, really impossible, but it is not, because that's how countries have been built. At some point in the United States, Harvard was young, Stanford was young. So there are good universities in Ukraine. We discussed several of them. Ukrainian Catholic University, they're competitors. Kyiv Mohyla Academy, they're competitors, but they're fantastic. Those are the future institutions which will determine the path for intellectual sovereignty of Ukraine. But if we don't have universities, young people will leave Ukraine, and we will not have the future. We'll have the territory, but we will not have the future. And this is as serious as the threat of Russia today to Ukraine. And what does the university do during the war? What should a university do? Of course, we have programs where alumni and people, and I always get emotional because it is like we have this veterans program where 70% of them went on the first days of the war, and now we have 15% of the alumni of the program gone. Not wounded, gone. 15% of the alumni of the classes. On some classes we have that. That takes a toll on the university. Because it's not a friend of a friend, it's just 15%. It's not 3, it's not 2, it's 15%. I knew all of these people. But the university should be a place for difficult conversations that the rest of the country might not have the ability or the luxury to discuss. Things like, how do we feel about mobilization? How do we talk with people who have fled the war and who exist because those who have not fled the war died? They are all Ukrainians. I wrote about this multiple times, and one of the comments on my Facebook or Twitter I read today was from a mother who lost her son, and how cruel the environment around her is in Ukraine. How other mothers are telling her, implying to her that it is her fault, that she allowed her kid to be conscripted. And they given examples how they have protected and hidden their children. And so they are alive today. And her response is that she stopped talking to these people because she has no answer. And so universities have to be a place where we talk about these things in a safe environment, and we try to find answers to extremely difficult questions, existential, fundamental ethical questions that Ukraine is facing. It's not black and white. Every life is different. Ernst Hemingway, recently I read what he thinks about writing. He said, a man knows what's right and wrong, but a writer or a thinker should not judge. A writer or a thinker should understand. So universities have to be the places which understand first and then lead, or provide places for leaders to rise, new generation. Universities are not necessarily the first responders to defend. They're not military, but they're first responders to protect democratic practices during the war, to create capabilities for mil-tech, for defense, for technological, and the places where we train people to help rebuild Ukraine after the war. So the legacy universities in Ukraine are not doing this job, with the exception of the 3 universities I've named. The job of a university always, but also during the war, is to teach people to be human. But our universities in Ukraine teach people mathematics, which is important, teach people to be engineers, which is important, but they also teach people to copy their answers from the internet and violate ethics and academic integrity. They teach them that favoritism and sexism is okay in an environment. Loyalty and not merit-based culture is okay. That has to stop. So the role of universities like Ukrainian Catholic University, Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and Kyiv School of Economics is to show that there is a cargo cult, there is a pretense to be a university, and that's been imposed or left to us by the legacy Soviet system, and that there are true universities. And I usually don't talk about this in public because it offends people. It offends hundreds of thousands of academics and students. But it's true. And intellectual honesty is the important characteristics of university. To say the truth and to be free in talking about the truth, no matter how painful it is to talk about the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful. I love hearing you talk about the universities are there to teach us how to be human, treat each other with dignity, and also places where it's safe to change your mind, where you can have a discussion. And that's, we can learn a lot from you. I don't know if you followed what's going on in the United States at universities, but we could learn a lot from you. For that, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Natalia, we talked a bit about Russian disinformation and what can be done to counter that in Europe and the United States and beyond.
Sure. I think we first should recognize the scope and scale of the challenge, including that there are multi-generational information operations that Russia launches years before it actually conducts military campaigns. I mean, Ukraine is actually a great example. As many of you would remember that Russia has set conditions in the information space for the original invasion of Ukraine as early as 2005. That's where the first sightings of Russia-backed so-called proxy networks were actually cited first. So I think, first of all, it's recognizing the scale and the scope of the challenge. But it's also really understanding that Russian information operations go way beyond troll factories and media. Russian information operations are very often supported by physical means. For example, Russia's attacks on Ukraine grain ports and the blockade last year was actually an information operation aimed to create a wedge between Ukraine and its allies around the world and to frame the West as responsible for the food shortage. Their Battle of Severodonetsk, for example, last year was also an effort to project the power beyond Russia's means at the time. That is another example in information operations supported by physical means. I think we also should recognize that while the West, I think, made some progress in countering disinformation at the tactical level and going after specific campaigns, we're still missing the big point. The biggest point being that Russia is actually trying to manipulate our will to act or try to convince us that it's not in our interest to act, for example, when it comes to Ukraine. And it has a number of efforts in this regard. I would say the first one is trying to convince Americans, but also Europeans, to choose inaction as a default. And Putin has quite a bit of practice with that domestically in Russia, where he created a circumstance where inaction is a default. He's trying to convince the Western world of that. I think the second, massive Russian disinformation operation globally, trying to convince the world that, well, maybe the West is just as bad as Russia. And I think that's actually having quite a significant impact on and the fuel and the narrative of defeatism, as Russia's trying to convince that, well, maybe you can ignore the Western world, and the moral relativism, I think, is actually a major threat. And going back to the stakes, I think if Russia wins, this narrative of moral relativism will surge, because if Russia wins, well, maybe some people will think maybe the bad guys weren't as bad, and I think it is actually a threat for democracy. But I think the final point I'll make on the disinformation is that we cannot view it as a separate part, as a separate point from Russia's strategic objectives, and we just need to recognize that we're at a point where there's no going back to the status quo. And I really want to emphasize that there are a lot of people in the West who would like to and think that they can go back to pre-February 22 status quo. And it's understandable, a desire not to think about the war or its elements of information-based warfare at all times. But unfortunately, certain realities make it just impossible. And the most fundamental of them is Russia's intent. Russia is a self-identified adversary to the West. We chose to ignore that reality for quite some time and ceded the advantage. But the last 2 years have fundamentally transformed Russian elites and society and really elevated the ultranational component of that society. And there are a lot of discussions, who's next after Putin, whether he'll be worse or not. If Russia loses in Ukraine, the next after Putin may or may not be like Putin. But if Russia wins in Ukraine, the next after Putin will most certainly be like Putin or worse, because of the political imperative that the empowered ultranationalist community would create in Russia. And I really want to emphasize, going back to the disinformation point, that Putin is preparing society in Russia for the long-term fight with the West, in narrative but also in action, with his explicit intent to rebuild Russia's large-scale war-fighting capability. Again, if Russia loses in Ukraine, that plan fails. If Russia wins, they will have ability to reconstitute their military. And it's not just going to be reconstituted military, it's the military that learned and, in this case, prevailed in the biggest war in the world. Why we in the West would ever want to self-impose this kind of defeat on ourselves, a threat, when we can avoid it and prevent it entirely if we only help Ukraine win.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, wow.
Right? So I'll ask you one more question, and then audience, please get ready. But Steve, you've done polling, political polling in the United States and in other countries.
About a dozen countries.
Yes. Okay. So you were talking about the Republicans in the U.S., which is roughly 25% of the electorate now. Most of it's almost 50% are independents, and then the rest are Democrats. So can you briefly talk about what works. You showed us what works with the evangelical Republicans. How is that different with Democrats, independents, and how is that different with Europeans? Because we need to know how to get everybody behind Ukraine who might send us.
Great question.
Some help.
So I polled Republican voters, and these are the most hardcore of the Republican supporters, and so their opinion is going to be drastically different than independents or centrist Democrats or far left Democrats, so or Europeans. But what we're finding is that they are the powerhouse. They're the tail that wags the dog behind the Republican Party right now, and so those are the people that are vocal. Those are the people that vote all the time. And so if you want to help Republicans come back to a position of supporting Ukraine, which, as the polling showed, they were at the beginning of the war, you need to show these people that people like them, you need to show the Protestants, the evangelicals in the United States, that people like them are suffering. And this is no longer, most Republican voters couldn't point to Ukraine on a map. And those, those are those guys with that funny accent. I see them on TV sometimes. And so it doesn't mean anything to them personally. Now, when you tell them that people that share their faith are being tortured in the most horrific ways, that then brings the war home to them, and they're more likely to support Ukraine. So, so my polling again is Republicans. Razum has done some amazing polling on other groups, and I've worked with them. Full disclosure, I'm on their advisory board. And I just want to say something that in terms of organizations, I mentioned the Taiwanese and the Israelis. They're very sophisticated. The pro-Israel community, in particular in the United States, is very well organized. They do a great job of keeping Israel and Israel's needs in front of the American people. Ukraine needs organizations like that. And I think Razum has the potential to do that. So, and they've done some great messaging that for all voters. So, the messaging for Democrats is going to be different. The message for Europeans is going to be different. And and if there's anyone else out there that wants to fund a poll, we can do that kind of polling. So.
Great. Thank you. Okay, questions from the audience? Yes. Here's Mike.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this discussion. My name is Yulia. I'm a human rights reporter from Ukraine. And I have two questions to whoever may be interested. So the first one is related to information. While studying abroad in different countries, actually UK, Italy, and the Czech Republic, I've noticed that oftentimes international students don't see Ukrainians as victims. And that is because we're white, we're Christians, we are supported by the US, and we are located in Europe. And what do you think is the reason for Ukraine not falling within the post-colonial perspective? Because I strongly believe that it should fall there. And my second question may be interesting to the moderator, if that's the format and if I may. So currently in Ukraine, there are more than 100,000 war crimes registered. And we do not have the capacity of our judicial system to deal with them. The International Criminal Court cherry picks only 5 or 10 cases, which it deems more important. And the European Court of Human Rights does not have jurisdiction over Russian crimes anymore because the country was expelled from the Council of Europe. So what would be the way to grant justice to those victims? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just, since we don't have a lot of time left, I'll just ask if there are other questions as well. Yeah?
So thank you so much, everybody, for a terrific panel. And I'm Catherine Valinga. And so Ukraine is important. Ukraine can feed the world. Ukraine has, we've heard about rare mineral reserves that are absolutely necessary. We need to change the mind of Republicans. So, and my God, what you shared, Natalia, is the world, if Russia wins in Ukraine, is absolutely terrifying. So I guess I just want to hear the other part, which is we do it. Ukraine is victorious. We convince. Our dreams come true. Ukraine is victorious. What does that world look like after for the world? Because I know that what is at stake in Ukraine is, my sense is, it's the future of the world. It's a new world for all of us. And what does that look like? What does that mean?
Thank you. And anyone else? Maybe we have time for one more. Yeah?
Talking to a lot of people at Davos, especially Ukraine House Davos this year, I've heard a lot of people say that they feel renewed, they feel, I don't want to say rejuvenated, but they feel a new sense of purpose almost in supporting Ukraine. What are your takeaways from this conference, from Ukraine House Davos? But also, do you feel any of that? Do you feel this kind of new sense of passion?
Great, okay. Thank you. So this is going to be lightning because we don't have too much time. But maybe I'll ask Steve, maybe you can start with the first question, which is why are Ukrainians not viewed as victims?
That is a good question because there is a sense of, and I'll tell you this, that I work with the people from AIPAC, which is the Israeli organization that is the most influential in the United States, and there's multiple Israeli organizations, but and they're with us, they're working with us. They recognize that that Russia and Iran and China and North Korea are all working together, and they see the Ukrainian victory as their victory, but. There is a competition for attention, and so the Palestinian lobby and the Palestinian lobby is very powerful in the Democratic Party, and so and they're getting a lot of their messaging out. So, but like what the Israelis are doing is they're taking unedited. Like video of people of Hamas doing terrible things to women and children, and they're showing that to people. And Ukraine has not done that yet. I'm sure there's videos somewhere. I've asked for it, but that needs to get out. There's the scale of the horrific crimes in Ukraine is much more just by sheer force of population than Gaza, and but there's just such horrible video out about Gaza and Israel that it overshadows what happens in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Steve. And NATALIYA, do you want to talk about your experience here in Davos and whether it gives you hope or how it makes you feel?
And I'll answer your question about what the world looks like if Ukraine wins very briefly. I think first, asymmetry goes both ways. Ukraine is a linchpin of Russia's power, and if Russia is defeated in Ukraine, a lot of Russia's capability and intent to do harm in the world will be defeated too. It will be also a massive blow to anti-Western coalition. So we have to remember that actually one of the most effective and asymmetric ways to not just defeat Russia, but the entire coalition that's targeting free world is to help Ukraine win. I think second, US and NATO and Europeans should not forget that if Ukraine is victorious, when Ukraine is victorious, they will gain one of the most capable, militarily capable and loyal and appreciative ally who will be able to defend NATO's borders. And especially after what we heard from Minister Commission, Ukraine also is putting a lot of effort in rejuvenating its defense industrial base. They can help it sustain its ability to defend itself independently over time as well. So that's a massive asset and value that would be left on the table if we don't help Ukraine win. And I think it will also be the best case for democracy and the free people, as simple as that. And I think what gives me hope after this summit is while there are a lot of questions about the state and trajectory of this war, fundamentally, Western problem is much smaller than Russia. All the West needs to do to help Ukraine win is to appreciate its interest at stake, mobilize the potential that it already has, snap out of its moral paralysis, embrace its agency and its power, and mobilize resources around the objective of helping Ukraine defeat Russia on the battlefield.
Thank you, Natalia. And finally, Timothy, could you also share your vision of what happens when Ukraine wins?
Yeah, so I've thought a little bit about it before the panels during the last 2 years. Yeah, we all have, yeah, right. I think if you truly zoom out, the world right now is a depressing place. No one is talking seriously about climate change. Poverty, inequality, populism rising in Europe, not in the US, elsewhere. The essence of democracy is truth. There's no democracy if there is no truth in the public discourse. And US is losing it in real time, the truth in the public discourse. Europe in some areas, in some countries, is losing it. We see it in real time. People think democracy is institutions. Democracy is not institutions. It's the truth. And people believing in the truth, defending institutions, which enable truth to be a part of the public discourse. And we are losing it. And if we look in the history of humankind, democracies are an accident. Greece, Athens have fell because they debated for too long whether it's worth to put up the army to face Prince Philip. That's what democracies do. They are debating instead of stopping the threat, and that's what the Western democracies are doing now. So that's a depressing outlook. And if you look at Israel and Gaza, you know, what's the solution in sight? We're going to have some kind of good outcome in the next year, 5, 10. Let's look broadly at Asia, Africa. You know, and I see how people respond to that by saying, you know, let's just give up. You know, it's depressing. It's none of it. We can't fix it, basically. But there is one angle of attack on all of this, and it is in Ukraine right now. If Ukraine wins, Europe will be emboldened. Europe is going to find its voice. The truth will prevail. Justice will prevail. People will believe that the bad things, that culprits could be punished, that no matter how strong you are, you don't win. That an underdog who has been unjustly bullied can win, that justice can be served, that people who try to coerce others could be stopped and shown a lesson. And all it takes is a fraction of the GDP of the Western world. Not even double digits. 1 or 2% of GDP would do the job of the Western world. So I think people gradually come to realize it, especially in Europe. We see countries like Germany or France and their leaders finding their voice and changing their positions throughout the war and becoming stronger allies of Ukraine. We see how the Central and Eastern Europe is one of the strongest, if not the strongest coalition of allies, despite domestic politics. We see how Europe is finding a way to deal with Orban. And we are also seeing it in real time. The US should show some leadership. But I also think that US fundamentally is built on the idea of freedom and protecting the underdog who has been unjustly attacked. And so the US will find its voice too.
Beautiful.
And once Ukraine wins, the clouds will start disappearing. The world will become a better place.
I love that. So great. So great. I love that. Well, I'll just say briefly on the question of the war crimes that Prosecutor General Kostin has said that he plans to prosecute every single last case. And I love that. I love that because every single one needs to be prosecuted. So I don't know what's going to happen in the end, but we're going to do everything we can to work with them to make sure that that happens. I just want to pick up on something you said. I think you're right in so many ways. The world is kind of a depressing place, and that's a lot of what I've heard here in Davos. But I also think that there's this sensibility of victimization, of people feeling like global warming is so big, there's nothing I can do about it. War is so big, there's nothing I can do about it. And the economy is so difficult, and there's nothing I can do about it. And I feel like a victim. And, you know, in my work of 40 years in human rights, the difference between a victim and a hero is activism with a loving heart. And I think that that's the message we hear again and again and again from Ukraine. And that's why I think what you're saying about Ukraine's victory is not just going to be about Ukraine. It's going to show all of us all over the world that we can overcome overwhelming odds and create change and build the more just and peaceful world that we all dream of. And I'll just leave you with this. When during his inauguration, President Kennedy said something that many people remember, which was, "My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Okay, no country has taken that more to heart than Ukraine. But the next line he said, most people don't remember, he said, "My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what the United States can do for you, but what we can do working together for the freedom of all humanity." And to me, that's what we're doing here today. That's what this panel is about. That's what Ukraine House is about, Davos. That's what this struggle for democracy and human rights and a rules-based world order, our love of our families, our care for those kids who've been kidnapped and taken to Russia, the incredible courage and bravery that we've been inspired by the people of Ukraine. That's why we're here. Let's indeed go forth from this room, from this Davos, and think about how we can work together for the freedom of all mankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear speakers, for an excellent panel discussion. And we do hope for the victorious year. And let's all work on this. So this is a small gift from us. Do you have this, right? Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, yes. This is for you. This is from to keep you warm, That's a picture, yes. And then please, everyone, please stay. There will be a closing remarks and then followed by the networking reception afterwards. Please stay.